In the fall of 1929, a woman walks through the empty corridors of the Bagshot Palace, her footsteps echoing like sighs against cold marble. She wears a blue silk dress that mirrors the melancholy of the English sky, and at her neck hangs a pearl necklace that cost more than whole houses in London. But there is something disturbing in their elegance. Jewelry seems too heavy for their delicate neck, as if every gemstone carries the weight of a tear never spilled. It, in front of a Venetian mirror, and for a moment, only a moment, allows its real composition mask to dissolve. What is revealed is such a deep void that not all diamonds of the British Empire could fill it. This is the story of a princess who has turned jewelry into armor, silence into art, and performance pain. A woman who has learned that sometimes the only way to survive royalty is to disappear inside her. If you're fascinated by these forgotten stories of the aristocracy, where luxury and tragedy intertwine as silk and blood wires, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we explore not only golden lives, but the shadows they project through the centuries. Margaret Victoria Augusta Charlotte Nora, Princess of Connaught, was born on January 15, 1882, at Bagshot Palace, Surrey. He was the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, third son of Queen Victoria, and Princess Louise Margaret of Prussia. His birth was celebrated with cannons saved and church bells, but already carried the weight of a time that was dying. The 19th century agonized, and with it, the golden certainty that the world belonged forever to the crowns of Europe. Margaret's childhood took place between palaces, whispered from history, and gardens, where each rose was planted with the military accuracy that defined the Victorian era. She grew up involved in French Toul and imperial expectations, but there was something in the child that disturbed the German rules. Margaret had an unnatural stillness for a princess. While other royal children learned to command rooms with their presence, she learned to disappear in them. His first official portraits reveal a girl with dark-eyed and serious expression, dressed in white sets that make her skin look almost translucent. There are in these photographs a ghostly quality, as if Margaret already knew that her life would be more about absence than presence, more about what she would not say, about what she would proclaim to the world. Melancholy in Margaret was not defective, it was refinement. It was the hallmark of a sensitivity that he perceived, even before the adults around him, that the golden world of the European monarchy was built on sand foundations. Each protocol lesson, each French class, each piano session was permeated by an imminent ending that the child absorbed as a sponge absorbs water. When Margaret turned 10, she had already learned that princesses do not cry in public, do not express political opinions, and show no personal preferences that can compromise diplomatic alliances. She had learned, in essence, that being a princess meant being a beautiful, empty object, a royal doll whose sole function was to reflect the glory of others. Margaret's adolescence years coincided with the heyday and the beginning of the decay of Belle Epoque. It was a time when European courts competed not only in political power, but in aesthetic magnificence. Buckingham Palace dances were theaters where each gesture was choreographed, each dress was a political statement, and each smile was diplomacy in action. Margaret has become a virtuosity of this performance. At 16, she already dominated the art of being present while remained fundamentally absent. Her public appearances were studies in controlled elegance. She wore Worth and Paquin as silk armor and jewelry that worked like talismans against genuine human proximity. In 1901, when her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, died, Margaret was among the princesses who followed the funeral procession. The photographs of that day show her wrapped in black crepe, her face covered with a veil, such a figure of mourning that she seemed to have been carved in her own pain. But those who watched her closely noticed something disturbing. Margaret didn't seem to be beyond the Queen's death. She seemed to be mourned by her own life. The rise of King Eduardo VII brought changes to the British court. The new king favored a less austere, more continental atmosphere. There were more parties, more theater, more permission for the real personalities to express themselves. For Margaret, this was simultaneously liberation and prison. She could now go to literary soirée and art collections, but each new experience just deepened her feeling of observing life through thick glass. In these years, Margaret has developed her two great passions, jewelry and loneliness. The jewelry because they were beautiful, durable, and silent, qualities she aspired to possess. Loneliness because it was the only space where it didn't need to perform royalty to anyone. She spent hours in her private quarters, organizing and reorganizing her yoke collections, as if each diamond was a silent prayer, each pearl a crystallized tear. In 1905, at the age of 23, Margaret was promised to marry Prince Gustav Adolf of Sweden, future Gustav VI Adolf. It was a politically advantageous alliance, strengthened the ties between the United Kingdom and Scandinavia in a time of growing European tension. For Margaret, it was the moment when her life was no longer her own property and became completely heritage of two crowns. The wedding ceremony, held at the São Jorge Chapel at Windsor Castle on June 15, 1905, was an Edwardian magnificent show. Margaret wore a silver Wable white satin dress, a diamond tiara that had belonged to Queen Victoria, and a lace veil from Brussels that cost the equivalent of a small rural property. She was dazzling and absolutely empty, like an infinitely precious porcelain doll and eternally changes. The official wedding photographs show Margaret alongside Gustav Adolf, both posing with the rigidity of statues. There is something deeply disturbing in the bride's expression. She doesn't seem happy or sad, but absent, as if her soul had abandoned her body at the moment the veil was placed on her head. The marital life in Sweden went to Margaret a golden exile. She settled in the royal palace of Stockholm, where she quickly discovered that being a princess heiress of Sweden meant being even more invisible than she had been as a princess of Connaught. The Swedish court was more austere, more protocol, quieter. Margaret adapted to this new stillness as a plant adapts to the shadow, not blooming, but surviving. During the early years of marriage, Margaret fulfilled her dynastic duty, giving birth to 5 children. Gustav Adolf in 1906, Sigvard in 1907, Ingrid in 1910, Bertil in 1912, and Karl Johann in 1916. Each pregnancy was an experience of progressive dissolution. Margaret became less visible with each delivery, as if each child took a part of his already fragile substance. The family photographs of this period show a woman gradually erasing. Margaret always appears on the periphery of portraits, dressed in increasingly neutral tones, their increasingly discreet jewelry, their increasingly mechanical smile. It was as if she were practicing for her own disappearance. World War I came to Margaret as a confirmation of its worst intuitions on the fragility of the aristocratic world. Although Sweden remained neutral, Margaret saw her childhood world shattered. Cousins became enemies, palaces were looted, crowns rolled through the cobblestones of St. Petersburg. During the war years, Margaret developed a routine of meticulous forgetfulness. She organized charity events with the accuracy of a general, visited hospitals with the regularity of a timer, and wrote letters for soldiers with the coldness of a bureaucrat. It was as if I decided that the best way to survive the collapse of civilization was to become a perfect machine of princely kindness. Their jewels in this period had become their only form of emotional expression. When the news was particularly devastating, the death of Tsar Nicholas II, the fall of Kaiser Guilherme II, Margaret appeared in public using his most dramatic pieces, the emerald necklace that had inherited from his mother, the diamond earrings that Gustav Adolf had given him on the first wedding anniversary, the sapphire tiara he had used in his own crown heiress. It was as if each jewel was a silent statement of resistance, a change that still existed, that beauty still existed in the world, even when everything around it collapsed. But those who knew her intimately realized that the jewelry had also become a prison. Margaret seemed unable to appear in public without them, as if her identity had dissolved so much that she could only exist through the decorated ornaments. In 1917, when the Russian Revolution climaxed, Margaret suffered what her doctors diagnosed as nervous exhaustion. She spent 3 months inmate in her quarters, refusing to receive visits or appear at official events. During this period, according to the reports of her ladies, she spent hours before the mirror, putting and taking off her jewelry as if trying to find a combination that returned her soul to the body. Gustav Adolf died in 1950, at age 67, leaving Margaret widowed 68. The death of her husband, paradoxically, was both liberation and final sentence. Margaret was finally free of marital and dynastic obligations that had defined her adult life, but found that freedom, when it arrives too late, may be more cruel than prison. As Sweden's widow queen, Margaret could have taken on a more prominent public role, could have become a maternal figure for the Scandinavian monarchy, could have found purpose in cultural patronage or philanthropy. Instead, she chose an almost total seclusion. Margaret spent the last years of his life at the Sofiero Palace, a real property in southern Sweden that Gustav Adolf had loved it particularly. It was a place of melancholy beauty, gardens that flourished magnificently in spring and died spectacularly in the fall, rooms full of furniture covered by white sheets, corridors where the echo of lonely steps seemed to tell stories of ghosts. During these years, Margaret has developed a disturbing obsession. She began to methodically catalog all her possessions. Jewelry, dresses, photographs, letters, everything was inventory, tagged, organized in velvet, lined mahogany boxes. It was as if she were organizing her own extinction, meticulously preparing the file of a life that knew it would be forgotten. Margaret's only visits were from Stockholm and London jewelers, who were periodically cleaning and evaluating their collections. These visits became almost religious rituals. Margaret watched each piece being examined, cleaned, reevaluated, as if watching the preservation of sacred relics. The jewels were now not only their emotional armor, but also their only reliable company. They were beautiful, eternal, and absolutely seedlings. In 1954, Margaret suffered a stroke that left her partially widened. During the final 6 years of her life, she remained in her quarters, attended by Swedish nurses in a whispered voice, and who learned to move around the room as shadows so as not to disturb the stillness that her boss had grown for decades. Margaret died on May 1, 1920, at the age of 78, alone in her rooms at the Sofiero Palace. The night nurse found her in the morning, sitting on her favorite armchair in front of the window she gave to the gardens, wearing a white silk camcushion and pearl necklace that had been a gift of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. The funeral was a proper but discreet event. Margaret had left specific instructions. He wanted to be buried with only 3 pieces of his vast jewelry collection: the engagement ring that Gustav Adolf had given him in 1905, a rose-shaped diamond brooch that was a memory of his mother, and a simple pair of pearl earrings he had bought for herself in Paris, on the only trip she had made her life alone. The rest of his collection, hundreds of pieces that were worth fortunes, was divided between museums, distant relatives, and auction houses. Within a decade, the jewelry that had been his identity and his arrest were scattered around the world, decorating women who did not know where they came from or what a silent story they carried. The palaces where Margaret had lived were turned into museums or sold to entrepreneurs who converted them into luxury hotels. His official portraits were relegated to deposits of art galleries, occasionally displayed in exhibitions on forgotten princesses of Europe that attracted curious but not true memory. Within a generation, Margaret of Connaught had become exactly what it had always been: a beautiful decorative object whose sole function was to illustrate a time that had disappeared forever. The difference was that now she was dead, and her extinction was complete. After Margaret's death, when the actual administrators began the process of cataloging their belongings, they made a disturbing discovery. In the mahogany cabinets of their private rooms, they found hundreds of small boxes, each containing a single object: a dress button, a lace fragment, a dry pink petal, a broken necklace account. Each box was tagged with a date and a location, written in the perfect handwriting that Margaret had learned from German rules. London, June 15th, 1905. Fragment of the bride veil. Stockholm, April 12th, 1918. Coat button worn on the funeral of cousin Nicholas. Sofiero, September 3rd, 1955. Last brooch used in public. It was as if Margaret had spent decades collecting fragments of her own dissolution, metallicously cataloging the pieces of herself that she was losing over the years. Each small object was a silent testimony of a moment when it had been present in the world, but also an indication of how fragile this presence was: transitory, constantly threatened with extinction. Administrators did not know what to do with these intimate collections. They had no monetary, historical, or artistic value. They were simply the archaeological traces of a life lived on the bank, the fragments of a woman who had become an expert in her own absence. Most of these boxes were incinerated. Some have been preserved in the Swedish Real Archives, where they remain today on dusty shelves, waiting for historians who may never come. Margaret had even managed to maintain her preference for invisibility. There is a photograph of Margaret taken in 1958, 2 years before his death, which summarizes all his existence. She is sitting in her library at the Sofiero Palace, surrounded by bookshelves she probably never read, wearing a gray wool dress and a pearl necklace that had belonged to her great-grandmother. What makes photography disturbing is not what it shows, but what it suggests. Margaret is looking at the camera, but her eyes seem to be focused on an infinitely distant point. There is in its expression a quality of transparency, as if decades of voluntary invisibility had finally made their soul literally translucent. His hands, folded on his lap, hold a small oval portrait, probably from his mother or one of his children. But the portrait is turned down, so we cannot see the face it contemplates. It is a gesture that perfectly summarizes Margaret's life, always holding memories, but never sharing them, always looking to the past, but keeping it private, always physically present, but fundamentally absent from its own existence. The photograph was taken by one of the last journalists to get an audience with Margaret. In his report, he wrote that she had answered all his questions with educated monosyllables, who had served tea in porcelain of Sèvres with the accuracy of a religious ritual, and had said goodbye to him with a smile that was perfectly courteous and completely empty. It was 1958, and Margaret was already a living anachronism. The world had changed radically since its youth. 2 world wars, decolonization, the emergence of pop culture, the democratization of social life. But Margaret remained unchanging, like an amber, preserved royal doll, beautiful, intact, and completely irrelevant. Margaret's sons, Gustav Adolf, Sigvard, Ingrid, Bertil, and Karl Johann, grew up to become respected public figures, but all carried the brands of education received from a mother who had transformed the emotional absence into the form of art. They learned to be princely, competent, correct, but also learned that love was something that expressed itself through expensive gifts and formal gestures, never through genuine intimacy. Ingrid, who became Queen of Denmark, spent his whole life trying to be the opposite of his mother, accessible, warm, involved with public life. But those who knew her intimately noted that in times of crisis, she would withdraw to a stillness that was disturbingly echoing the loneliness cultivated by Margaret. Sigvard, who renounced his titles to marry a commoner, once declared in a rare interview that he had spent his entire childhood trying to make his mother smile genuinely, never succeeding. His memories of Margaret were of an ever-present but never available woman, always elegant but never relaxed, always loving in theory but emotionally untouchable in practice. Margaret's real heritage was not his jewelry or palaces, but a relationship pattern based on the emotional distance disguised as aristocratic refinement. She had taught children that love meant not to disturb, that intimacy was synonymous with vulgarity, and that the best way to protect someone was to stay so distant that she could not cause disappointment. This pattern was perpetuated through the following generations. Margaret's grandchildren grew in silent luxury environments, where emotions were expressed through objects, expensive birthday gifts, careful clothes, aesthetic precision rooms. It was a language of love coded in materiality, an emotional communication system based on the absence of direct communication. In the last years of life, Margaret had turned her quarters into Sofiero into a kind of museum dedicated to her own non-existence. Each room was organized as a thematic exhibition. The jewelry room, where their collections were displayed in glass showcases. The room of the dresses, where their gala costumes were preserved in cedar cabinets. The fourth of the photographs, where hundreds of official portraits documented decades of formal presence and emotional absence. She had hired a professional archivist to organize her correspondence, thousands of letters received and sent over decades, all written in a language of protocol that never revealed personal thinking or genuine feeling. Reading these letters was how to observe a masterful exercise of human communication that never became human. Margaret spent hours walking through these museum rooms as a visitor in her own life. She adjusted a tiara's position here, reorganized a glove drawer there, as if healing an exhibition about a person who had known very well but never really understood. Their only regular companies were women who came to clean their jewelry, experts from London and Paris who treated each piece with the reverence due to archaeological artifacts. Margaret attended these cleaning rituals with almost hypnotic intensity, as if observing the preservation of the last traces of his soul. During these procedures, she occasionally told stories about the pieces, where she had acquired them, what occasions she had used them, what compliments had received. But their narratives were always centered on objects, never in itself. It was as if Margaret had become a biographer of her own possessions, an expert in the history of everything that had decorated her, but unable to tell the story of the woman who had been decorated. Margaret's last public appearance was in December 1959 at the traditional Christmas celebration of the Swedish royal family. The photographs of that event show a 77-year-old woman dressed in navy velvet, wearing a discreet set of pearls and diamonds, who had personally chosen for the occasion. What makes these images particularly disturbing is their consciously choreographed farewell quality. Margaret seems to be performing not only his role as a widowed queen, but also his own conclusion. Each gesture is measured, each expression is rehearsed, as if it were directing its last appearance in the theater of public life. During dinner, according to witnesses, Margaret spoke less than the usual, which was very little. She smiled in the appropriate hours, nodded when expected, and distributed gifts with the mechanical generosity that had characterized decades of real natals. But there was a definitive quality in their movements, as if each action was also a farewell. After dinner, Margaret asked to be photographed one last time with all her favorite jewels. The result was a portrait that is simultaneously magnificent and haunted. Margaret appears like a queen out of a Gothic fairy tale, covered with glows that shine like stars on her translucent skin, but with eyes that seem to be contemplating a kingdom beyond life. She never appeared in public. The next 4 months were passed on complete imprisonment in Sofiero, where Margaret finally was allowed to practice the invisibility she had desired since childhood. It was as if she were rehearsing to death, improving the art of not being present. She had grown throughout her life. When the actual administrators made the final inventory of Margaret's belongings, they found that she had left detailed instructions to the fate of each significant item. But the instructions revealed a disturbing obsession with posthumous control. Margaret had specified not only those who should receive each object, but also how each piece should be presented, stored, and eventually transmitted to the next generations. His jewelry was divided between children and grandchildren according to a system that seemed more aesthetic than in affection. Each heir received pieces that Margaret considered appropriate to her future role in the monarchy, as if she were distributing uniforms to a performance she would continue even after her death. Even more disturbing was finding that Margaret had written personal letters to be delivered to each family member after his death. These letters, when finally opened, contained no declarations of love or maternal advice, but instructions on how to wear, take care, and preserve the jewelry that each person had inherited. It was as if Margaret, even in death, could not express direct human emotions, but only relate to the world through the objects that had collected. His last words for his children were about the importance of cleaning pearls with soft cloths and keeping diamonds away from direct sunlight. The longest letter was left to Ingrid, his only daughter. It contained detailed pages about the story of each piece in the real collection, but it ended with a single personal sentence. "I hope these beauties bring you the peace they could never bring to me." It was the closest admission to Margaret's emotional vulnerability had done in all recorded life. 20 years after Margaret's death, when from the Sofiero Palace was transformed into a public museum, the curators discovered a room that had remained sealed since 1960. It was a small private cabinet that Margaret had used as a personal office, but that his heirs had decided to preserve exactly how she had left him. The room contained Margaret's personal library, hundreds of books on art history, jewelry, royal genealogy, and biography of European princesses. But what caught the attention of the experts was the discovery that Margaret had written comments on the backs of almost all books, creating an indirect diary of his most intimate thoughts. His notes revealed a woman of considerable intelligence and abyssal loneliness. She had used the stories of other princesses to process her own experience, writing observations such as, she also learned that smiling is work, alongside Maria Antonietta's biographies, or solitude is the price of perfection, on the margins of texts on the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. The most disturbing were the comments on historical jewelry. Margaret had noted values, technical descriptions, and stories of provenance with the accuracy of a professional expert, but her personal observations suggested that she saw jewelry less as beauty objects than as emotional survival tools. Diamonds have no questions, she had written. Pearls don't expect answers. Among the rolls left in the office, curators also found letters of letters never sent, hundreds of genuine communication attempts with children, friends, and even Gustav Adolf. These letters contained the emotions that Margaret had never been able to express in life: frustration, love, fear, hope. But each draft ended incomplete, as if she always gave up when turning feelings into shared language. Today, almost half a century after his death, Margaret of Connaught exists mainly as a footnote in broader stories about 20th century European monarchies. His life is briefly mentioned in biographies of more famous relatives, catalogued in real genealogies, documented in photographic files of museums that few visit. But there is something in Margaret's history that resonates in a disturbing way with contemporary issues about female identity, social performance, and the psychological cost of public perfection. She was the forerunner of a generation of women who learned to exist as images, to replace personality with style, to exchange emotional intimacy with aesthetic impeccability. His jewelry, spread across private collections and museums around the world, occasionally appear in auctions where they reach extraordinary prices. But buyers are usually unaware of the story of the woman who used them. They acquire objects for intrinsic beauty, not for the human narrative they carry. In 2018, the emerald necklace that Margaret had used in his coronation as a princess heiress of Sweden was sold by Sotheby's for £3 million. The auction catalogue described the play as an extraordinary example of Edwardian jewelry, with impeccable real provenance, but dedicated only 2 lines to the woman who had worn it for 5 decades. Margaret had become exactly what he always fears: a beautiful object whose sole function was to value other beautiful objects. Margaret's official photographs, when they appear in European royal exhibitions, are always accompanied by subtitles that emphasize their clothes, their jewelry, their family connections, never their personality, their thoughts, their internal struggles. It remains, even in the fundamentally decorative posterity, an elegant illustration of an era that is remembered more for its aesthetics than by its humanity. But occasionally, historians specializing in the private life of royalty discover fragments of the true Margaret between the lines of letters of others, in contemporary diaries, in unbudded memories of servants who have known it intimately. These fragments reveal a woman of keen sensitivity and voluntary isolation, someone who had turned invisibility into survival strategy. Margaret's influence extended far beyond her own life through her families, women who inherited not only her jewelry but also her standards of emotional behavior. Her daughter Ingrid, as Queen of Denmark, became known for her ability to maintain real composure under extremely difficult circumstances, a skill she had learned by observing her mother transforming any situation into protocol performance. Margaret's granddaughters grew in an atmosphere where elegance was synonymous with emotional distance, where refinement meant never revealing vulnerability, where being truly real implied being fundamentally unreachable. They learned Ram to wear jewelry as armor, dressed as uniforms, and smiles like masks that were much more elaborate and effective than any theatrical disguise. Margrethe II of Denmark, granddaughter of Margaret, developed in adulthood a complex relationship with his grandmother's inherited jewelry. In rare interviews, she admitted that using certain specific pieces, particularly a butterfly-shaped diamond brooch that had belonged to Margaret, caused her a strange feeling of performing a paper written by someone else. "When I put these jewelry," Margrethe once said, "I feel like I'm channeling not only my grandmother's dignity, but also her loneliness. It's as if every diamond carries a tear she never allowed her to be spilled." It was one of the most intimate observations ever made about Margaret by a family member. Margaret's great-grandchildren, growing up in the 21st century, occasionally questioned the emotional heritage they received. Some have consciously chose to break the patterns of aristocratic distance, opting for more affordable lives and more direct relationships. Others unconsciously perpetuate the isolated elegance rituals that Margaret had coded decades earlier. But all of them, regardless of their personal choices, carry in their guarding parts that belong to Margaret, and all report the same sensation strange when wearing them: a combination of power and melancholy, as if wearing not only jewelry but also the memory of a sadness that was never properly processed. In 2020, 60 years after Margaret's death, the Sofiero Palace inaugurated a permanent exhibition dedicated to its memory. Titled The Invisible Princess, Margaret de Connaught and the Art of Real Absence, the show tried for the first time to present Margaret not only as a historical figure, but as a psychological phenomenon. Exposure was structured in a conventional way. Instead of following a linear chronology, curators created a series of thematic environments that exploited different aspects of Margaret's invisibility. There was the fourth of the mirrors, where visitors could experience the feeling of constantly observing and being observed. The silent jewelry office, where Margaret's pieces were presented not as beauty objects, but as nonverbal communication tools. The most disturbing environment was the Library of Oblivion, a recreation of Margaret's private office in Sofiero. Visitors could examine replicas of their noted books, read excerpts from their never-sent letters, and hear audio recordings based on their private writings, interpreted by an actress who whispered Margaret's words as if they were ghostly confessions. The reaction of the public was intensely emotional. Many visitors reported leaving the exhibition with an inexplicable feeling of melancholy, as if they had indirectly experienced decades of elegant loneliness. Art critics observed that the show had a rare effect, turning absence into presence, making the void become tangible. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the exposure was its final section, entitled Contemporary Mirrors. There, the curators presented questions about how the patterns established by Margaret, constant public performance, replacement of intimacy with aesthetics, use of material objects such as emotional language, remained relevant in the 21st century. Interactive panels asked visitors about their own relationships with social networks, celebrity culture, and contemporary pressure to constantly cure an idealized version of oneself. The implicit message was clear. Margaret had been the precursor of dilemmas that now affected millions of people, an involuntary pioneer of life as permanent performance. Psychologists specializing in real family dynamics have begun in recent years to study the Margaret de Connaught phenomenon, a pattern of behavior characterized by the replacement of emotional intimacy with aesthetic perfection, the use of material objects, such as effective language, and the transformation of absence into control strategy. Dr. Dirk Helena Nordstrom of the University of Stockholm published in 2019 an influential study on intergenerational aristocratic trauma, in which he analyzed as behavioral patterns established by figures such as Margaret themselves perpetuated through real families during generations. According to Nordstrom, Margaret had developed what she calls emotional protocol, a system where genuine feelings are consistently translated into formal gestures, thus avoiding the vulnerability of direct communication. Margaret de Connaught, writes Nordstrom, represents an extreme case of pathological adaptation to the pressures of aristocratic public life. She developed survival mechanisms so sophisticated that they eventually became indistinguishable from their personality. The tragedy is that these mechanisms, although effective in preserving public dignity, eventually consumed their authentic personal experience. Nordstrom's study identified similar patterns in other female real figures of the period. The tendency to develop obsessions with material objects as a substitute for human relationships, the preference for indirect communication through symbolic gifts and gestures, and the eventual transformation of the person into a decorative object within the family environment. But Nordstrom also noted that the Margaret phenomenon was not limited to the aristocracy. Similar patterns appeared in any context where women were consistently valued more for their appearance and behavior than their personality or achievements, that is, practically throughout the Western society of the last 2 centuries. Margaret de Connaught, concludes Nordstrom, it was not just the victim of the specific expectations of Edwardian royalty, but of a broader system that taught women to exist as beautiful objects rather than complex subjects. His case is extreme only in their historical visibility, not in their essence. In 2021, during the renovation of a rural property in Kent that had belonged to Margaret's distant relatives, a portrait was discovered that no one knew existed. The painting, dated from 1923, showed Margaret at 41, sitting in a garden during what seemed to be a private moment, beaten. What made the extraordinary portrait was not its artistic quality. The painter was competent but not exceptional, but his emotional quality. For the first time in decades of visual documentation, Margaret appeared not as a princess performing royalty, but as a woman experiencing a moment of unlinced humanity. In the painting, Margaret wears a simple yellow cotton dress without jewelry besides her wedding ring. Her hair is partially loose, escaping from the formal hairstyle that characterized all her other representations. But the most disturbing is her expression. She is looking out of the painting with a vulnerable intensity that suggests that she was captured in a moment of genuine, possibly painful reflection. The discovery of the portrait caused a sensation among royal historians. For the first time, there was a visual evidence that Margaret had had moments, albeit rare, of non-performic existence. The portrait suggested that under decades of controlled elegance had existed a woman capable of direct emotional experience. Painting technical analyses revealed that it had been done quickly, probably during a single session, and that Margaret had posed for her in secret. There were no official registrations of the commission, payment, or even the artist's identity. It was as if Margaret had stolen a moment to be documented not as a princess, but as a person. The portrait was eventually acquired by the National Gallery of Portraits of London, where it was shown in a special exhibition entitled The Face Behind the Crown: Private Moments of Public Royalty. The public's response was intense. Many visitors reported being emotionally disturbed by the raw humanity of the image, so different from the glacial composition that characterized all other representations of Margaret. Critics noted that the portrait functioned almost as forensic evidence of a personality that had been systematically suppressed. "It's like finding a single-color photography in a full collection of black and white images," wrote a critic on the Times. "Suddenly we realized that there was life where we thought there was only composition." The last months of Margaret's life have been documented in detail by his personal nurse, Astrid Larsen, who kept a private diary discovered only in 2015 when Larsen herself died at age 94. Larsen's notes provide the most intimate report available on Margaret's final moments, revealing aspects of his personality that had never been publicly recorded. According to Larsen, Margaret spent her last months in a routine that was simultaneously meticulous and melancholy. She woke up every morning at 7 a.m. needed, had breakfast served in porcelain of Sèvres, who had been a wedding gift from Eduardo Zinten, and spent 2 hours tidying up, even knowing that he would not receive visits or leave his quarters. "She dressed every day like appearing at a state event," wrote Larsen. "I chose dresses, jewelry, shoes with the same care as always, but there was no one to impress but the mirrors and me. It was as if she couldn't exist without constantly performing princess, even when there was no audience." Margaret's afternoons were dedicated to what E.U. Larsen described as personal archaeology. She systematically revisited drawers, cabinets, jewelry boxes, as if cataloging a life that did not completely recognize like yours. Occasionally she held a piece, a brooch, a photograph, a pair of gloves, for long periods, as if trying to extract memories that objects could contain. "One afternoon," recorded Larsen, "I found her crying silently as I held a small golden baby shoe. When I asked who it was, she said, 'From a child I had known for a long time.' It took me weeks to realize that she was referring to herself. The shoe was yours, preserved since childhood by sentimental households. In recent days, Margaret has developed the habit of talking to her jewelry, addressing specific pieces as if they were confidants who could keep secrets she had never been able to share with humans. Larsen recorded fragments of these conversations that revealed decades of processed loneliness. She said things like, 'You know me better than anyone,' or 'You never disappointed me.'" It was simultaneously touching and disturbing, a 78-year-old woman finding the emotional intimacy she had never been able to build with people in the Diamond Company. The morning Margaret died, Larsen found her sitting on her favorite armchair, wearing a white silk camcushion and pearl necklace that had been present from Queen Victoria. His hands were folded on his lap, holding a small handmaid made of silver and ivory that had belonged to his mother. The mirror was positioned so that Margaret could see her own reflection when she died. Larsen speculated in his diary that this had been intentional, that Margaret had chosen to spend his last moments looking at herself, perhaps finally trying to recognize the woman who had become after decades of existing mainly as a reflection of the expectations of others. "There was something deeply tragic in the scene," wrote Larsen. "She died as she had lived, watching her own image, but this time without audience to impress. It was as if she finally had permission to look honestly, but only when it was too late to do anything with what she could find out." Margaret's death was officially attributed to heart failure, but Larsen offers a more poetic interpretation. "I believe she died of existential exhaustion. 78 years performing a life that never completely became her entirely consumed all her ability to continue." In the weeks following the funeral, Larsen was in charge of organizing Margaret's personal belongings. It was then that he discovered something that considered deeply significant. Hidden at the bottom of Margaret's most private drawer, there was a single object that did not match the rest: a small common diary with worn leather cover and yellowish pages. The diary contained only one entrance, dated 15th of January 1957, Margaret's 75th anniversary. The handwriting was hers, but shaking, suggesting that it had been written quickly, perhaps in a moment of unusual emotional courage. "Today I turned 75 years old, but I'm not sure how old I really lived. I spent so much time being what I expected from me that I forgot what I could have been if I had chosen. My jewelry is beautiful, my dresses are perfect, my modes are impeccable, but where am I, all Margaret under the princess? Maybe it's too late to find out." It was the only time in all his documented life that Margaret had recorded genuinely personal thoughts about his own existence. Larsen kept the diary for decades, uncertain about what to do with this posthumous confession. When he finally decided to include him in his own writings, he explained, I felt that he deserved that at least one person knew he had questioned his own life, even once, even if only for herself. Margaret of Connaught died on May 1st, 1920, but his history resonates with particular force in the 21st century, at a time when millions of people live growing lives where personal identity is constantly mediated by carefully healed images, where genuine intimacy competes with the constant pressure of maintaining an idealized version of himself for public consumption. She was involuntary precursor of contemporary dilemmas about authenticity versus performance, about the psychological cost of aesthetic perfection, how material objects can simultaneously express and suppress personal identity. Margaret turned her life into such a refined work of art that eventually nothing left but art. The woman disappeared behind the composition. Your jewelry collection, ESP Al-Hada by museums and private collections around the world, it is still admired for its technical beauty and historical provenance. But rarely does anyone ask about the woman who used them, what they meant to her beyond decoration, how each piece worked simultaneously as protection in prison. Margaret's official photographs, preserved in real archives and occasionally displayed in European monarchy exhibitions, show decades of impeccable elegance. But they are also documents of an extreme self-support experiment, visual records of how a person can gradually turn into a decorative object within their own life. Margaret of Connaught leaves us a disturbing question. When does the performance of an identity become more real than the original identity? At what point does the mask fuse so completely with the face that removes it is impossible? And what is the cost for a human soul to achieve such refined perfection that it leaves no room for failures, growth, or change? She got what every princess of her day was taught to desire. She became absolutely blameless, eternally elegant, unquestionably suitable for her real role. But the price of this perfection was the existence itself. Margaret became so successful in being a princess who was no longer a person. Your true inheritance is not the jewelry you have collected or the palaces you have inhabited, but rather a question that remains painfully relevant. Is it possible to live a lifetime by performing a role, even a golden role, without eventually forgetting who you were before you take the stage? Margaret of Connaught never found an answer, perhaps because, in the end, she had become her own question. In Sofiero's silence, where Margaret's gardens still flourish and die in seasonal cycles, the echo of a life lived on the banks of their own existence remains, a whispered memory that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not to die young, but to live as long as someone you could completely forget.